Nick, it's great to see you. Welcome back to our second edition of The Ripple Effect. I'm excited to unpack what's making waves this week, and the topic is lithium. So, back in the headlines, and for good reason, lithium is the backbone of the electric vehicle revolution, and it's all over the news right now. In particular, Russia seized control of the Ukraine's lithium mines, really highlighting the geopolitical stakes in this global race for the critical mineral. We've got news on Serbia, Rio Tinto planning to create a standalone lithium division after closing a $6.7 billion acquisition of Arcadium Lithium. And of course, back in North America, big developments around the US Department of Energy approving a $1 billion loan program for domestic lithium mining projects, including Rhyolite, if I'm pronouncing that right, Rhyolite Ridge, a project in Nevada, and then Standard Lithium in Arkansas, securing a $225 million grant for developing cutting-edge extraction technologies. So lots in the news. Nicholas, let's unpack that to start. Why does lithium matter?
Well, there's a few things here, and I think just going from why lithium matters into the European security issue as a starting point here. If you look at, lithium, and it's very similar to other critical materials that, it was historically an industrial the input that was largely forgotten and not necessarily a growth industry, right? And so you look at, 10 years ago, 30% of the lithium market was going to batteries. Now, that's over 80%, and the lion's share of the future demand is going to be from batteries. And so, specifically why that matters. The lithium is used both in energy storage, the batteries for the grid. And so think, the sun doesn't shine at night. You store the battery during the day while the sun is shining, solar is producing, and disperse it at night, right? There is substitution pathways to get lithium out of the bill of materials on the grid side. Flipping to the electric vehicle side, so Tesla, GM, Toyota, name your automaker here. There's not really a pathway to substitute lithium out of mobility applications. And so it's hypercritical there. And you think about the lithium value chain, there's hard rock lithium and brine-based lithium. And so globally, lithium comes from, so hard rock primarily from Australia, brine from South America. So in particular, the Chile and Argentina. And so, you kind of look at the value chain broadly, you get to the next step, you have an intermediate processing and refining part of the value chain that you have carbonate and hydroxide. And so you think about how that works. Lithium carbonate goes primarily into lithium iron phosphate batteries, which are one technology used by end automakers, and the other lithium hydroxide primarily supply nickel, manganese, cobalt batteries. And so it's interesting there as you can look at this situation. It's indispensable, and the supply chain is relatively tailored to these end markets. And I think what's important there is we have a big shift here coming up with Trump's inauguration on policy is that
Right.
you look at lithium iron phosphate versus the nickel manganese cobalt, so LFP NMC. The LFP batteries are generally prioritized for lower cost, the medium range, whereas the NMC side is more the premium vehicle, longer range. And so we've kind of got this thing right now where, as the consumer demand for EVs outside of China is in its infancy, we now have, in addition to developing consumer preferences with limited data for these companies to deal with, policy uncertainty, and then in the EU, a major security flag that's gone off here. So,
Right.
to kind of reiterate, lithium is indispensable in the mobility market, and will continue to be so for the foreseeable future. But bear in mind, it's still a somewhat nascent industry, right? This is, if you look at benchmark middle intelligence, primary source of this, this is a 25 to $30 billion market, depending on what source you look at, but projected to be $130 billion market by 2032. So, a
Right.
lot of things in play there.
Yeah, that skyrocketing demand, growing sixfold in, next several years. So, obviously, there's a geopolitical competition going on. Let's talk about that.
I think that starting with one of the big crux of the issue here, if you look at kind of what's going on here, you've seen so Ukraine has the lithium reserves in its eastern the region, which Russia is now taken full delivery and control of. And
Right.
so you've got the with this situation here. I think a lot of the European perspective, and I think the American perspective as well, the has been, if you look at that, like the interview that was done with Vladimir Putin and Tucker Carlson, the I think was actually fantastic in the sense of, he laid out immediately, we'd like to reestablish borders from 100 years ago, 500 years ago. And so you have this situation here of when is this going to stop, this aggression, right? And so you look into the European situation. Serbia has the lithium reserves, and there's currently a project that's being undertaken to provide a European source there that's deemed to be sustainable over a long period of time. And so you look at this sphere of influence in Russia and aggression. While that's not in the immediate line of fire, I think a lot of Europeans, like if you look at the view going back to the World War II era, talking to friends on the continent in the UK, the viewpoint is that like if this is not stopped, it will show up in our backyard, right? And so I think that this, while the insignificant in the sense of Ukraine is not a lithium superpower, the aggression towards the resource-rich jurisdiction and its broader implications for Europe, if this is not contained going into next week with Trump's inauguration, are substantial. And you've seen, just over the last week, I mean, the Israel-Hamas ceasefire, the first wave of this, is coming into being here. There's still a lot to be sorted there, but what is interesting is that Trump is his new envoy, and he's taking credit for this, right? Which we don't have full information on how that got sorted. It's been working on for a long time, but he is going to be the front and center in the Ukraine negotiation here, and his first official thing that's come out has been lower the conscription age, put yourself in a position on the front lines to negotiate from a position of strength. And so, this situation, how this is going to get solved, has a lot of implications for European mineral security, just given the fact of the EU and the UK have a well-developed in demand policy for electric vehicles, and consumer preferences have adopted to a point where smaller the light passenger vehicles that are electrified are broadly the preference. And so the issue there is that if you kind of tie that into the real ripple effect of the US shifting gears, is that the EU is having challenges developing a domestic ecosystem without relying on China. And so the next most viable partner, as you see with value chains in the wake of the Ukraine-Russia situation with natural gas and liquefied natural gas, the US is deemed to be a viable partner. And the US is taking steps to address lithium independence, but there's also a fair amount of complexity associated with that.
Well, and to take that a step further, there's also the environmental concerns. So yes, we feel good driving around in an electric vehicle, but sometimes we overlook the impact of the environmental challenges around the intensive amount of water extraction required to get lithium out of the ground. So is there opportunities or focus around putting more dollars to work and investing more in innovation to ensure better extraction methods?
Well, I think there's a few things in play there, and I think that that one of the issues with mining, manufacturing, any kind of environmentally draining, for lack of better characterization, activity in the U.S. is there's going to be NIMBYism, there's going to be permitting challenges, and the degree for the Trump administration to walk those back to a point where it's free for all, for lack of better words, it's quite
Mhm.
limited because a lot of this is distributed towards state authority and local authority in many cases, and a federal override is while it's been discussed, very challenging to implement. And so I think you're seeing things where I think there's optimistic about the intersection of the independence and the environmental responsibility and innovation. You look at direct lithium extraction is a newer method that is being implemented specifically the Smackover region in the U.S., which covers the southern U.S. and the capital of this activity is
And
really in
Canada.
Arkansas. The
And
Canada, yeah, yeah.
yeah,
And
don't cut us
but
out of that good news picture.
it's really interesting though. I think that where I find if you look at the historical metals and mining space, most of those companies have been built on iron ore, which goes into the steel industry and comprises 50-60% of the addressable market for the metals and mining industry. You look to oil and gas, which is a much larger market with very, very established and deep capital markets, whereas the metals and mining sectors had issues in that area. Um, the direct lithium extraction value chain overlaps directly with the competencies of the oil and gas industry, and you've seen big investments from Equinor and Exxon
Yeah.
in this area. And it's actually, if you look at because one of the big problems with the oil and gas in energy transition is, you look at, the returns that these oil and gas companies make on their upstream extractive higher risk investments. They're quite high, right? And so you look at things like building a solar farm that has a long-term contract, and or getting into hydrogen, doing some of these things that while attractive are really like utility type returns versus like big, like the whole American characterization, the wildcat returns, right? And so, I think that while it's not in the same category, the direct lithium extraction part of the value chain represents an extractive, the investment opportunity adjacent for these oil and gas companies, well within their competencies. And you see, I mean, Exxon came out and said this, like, in our return bucket, it's close to, we believe, they don't have data yet, but it's close to, up where this upstream area is. And so I think that, in and really like part of this whole energy transition mineral security thing is like where are like the parallel or adjacencies where you can get industries to collaborate, right? That's been
Yeah.
this is one bright spot that appears to be developing where the metals and mining industry can directly collaborate with the competencies and depth of capital markets, which does not exist in the metals and mining space. The what really exists in the oil and gas industry, not the metals and mining industry.
Right. Okay, so another component of this ripple effect is, Donald Trump next week sort of hints around killing off the $7,500 consumer tax credit for EVs. What does that really look like in terms of impacting the demand for lithium?
The biggest, as we kind of discussed, lithium, there's a lot of discussion around kind of what lithium is. If you look at the data, it is a pure play electric vehicle commodity. And the issue here is that the demand center, while it has started forming, is in its very much its infancy in the US. And if this subsidy gets redacted or amended, I think you will see a lot of project cancellations. It's just because the issue here is that like, the it at present, we have a circumstance where the consumer preference is heavily subsidized to a certain degree, right? Like for lack of better characterization. And I think that, that if it is peeled back and it is okay to not think with environmental responsibility in the taking forth consumption, I think that some of this supply chain in the US will change quite a bit. And you saw a warning out there to really, crystallize this. You look at Albemarle, and there was a really good Financial Times, the article on their kind of warning to the market. Is they're like, look, like, right now, while China doesn't extract most of the lithium, they process and refine a large portion of it. And
Right.
some of these companies from mine to market are incredibly sophisticated there because they've had so many years to learn and iterate and do really get to know what works best, what doesn't, how to cut costs. And the real risk here, and I think that it'll be interesting to see because Trump and his entire administration are quite anti China, they're China hawks, right, broadly. And so I think what this tax credit does align with the methodology of their administration and getting away from China. Because I think that the issue here is if we don't develop that ecosystem, the learnings and the process knowledge and the incumbency of China, given that the EU as a demand center outside of China, which is, by the way, China is already the largest electric vehicle market from a consumer basis, th- their their knowledge will expand and they will cement that further over the next 4 years, and it will be too late to challenge that incumbency. And so we're really at a critical inflection point here, as to, do we want to have this domestic value chain in the US? Because if we destroy the demand center, it's not going to be possible.
Right. And looking further abroad, last in our last episode, we covered Trump's interest in Greenland, highlighting the riches and the critical minerals. And as a Canadian, we certainly didn't miss Canada potentially becoming a 51st state. So, lithium, looking at it more broadly, is it the new oil in terms of global power dynamics?
Well, I think this is actually a very interesting point, because you look at the situation with Australia is quite far from the US, right? Generally speaking, it's very if you're doing business in Australia and you're on Eastern the time, like you're up you're working weird hours, right? So like
And
I
like
think that
opposite ends, it's hard.
most people who clock in a 9 to 5 in the US are not going to be overly excited about taking a job where they're corresponding with Sydney, right? For like or so I think but you get closer to Chile, Argentina, that is same time zone.
Same time zone.
And similar to Australia, the shared value system and a lot of immigration has occurred, to place people from those countries at the center of the U.S. culture and connectivity. And so I think that one of the things that we'll see here, and you look at Chile is a bit different because there's been some challenges and direct displays of resource nationalism, but you look at Argentina, which is quite interesting. You have Javier Milei, who is a huge Trump fan, that has implemented a lot of things such as austerity, started to turn around inflation. It's had discussion about outright dollarization. I would watch that relationship, because I think that if we were going to go down that path, of the friend shoring, as everyone likes to call it, I think that is probably the most likely near-term union. And increasingly, depending upon the public acceptance has been mixed of Malay's policies. But if that starts to shift towards a positive territory, and he's mirroring Trump in a lot of ways, I think that Trump naturally likes to gravitate towards people who are implementing similar the types of policies, right? And so I think that union will become quite interesting, where you get into a muddy waters area that I personally am going to watch is, some of this discussion Trump has had is direct. It's an imperial style of opposing resource nationalism by other countries, right? Or the inklings of it. So we haven't seen that on full display because he hasn't negotiated a deal yet, but he's a deal guy, as we know. So I think that one of the things that will be really interesting is if that does start to go on the path of there will be some kind of union there, and this extends to other countries too. Some of the traditional the ownership, partnership, royalty requirements that come with exploiting natural resource in a underdeveloped or developing country per the appropriate classification standards. I would hazard to guess he's going to push back on that very heavily, with the rhetoric of the US as being treated unfairly, given it is providing defense capabilities, probably capital, and other things. And that, I think, is one thing you see with you look at the situation with just Nippon Steel, and that obviously blocked by Biden, supported by Trump, and now you have Cleveland Cliffs looking to do a purchase there, and some really negative commentary about Japan. You look back at Trump, and to tie this fully in, the late '80s, Trump was a huge critic of the U.S. guaranteeing Japanese defense, and getting ripped off by Japanese companies in the height of the Japanese economic expansion. And so I think that that is his true thought on some of this. I think that we're going to see a lot of these countries that have strategic value to the US getting the immediate negotiating tactic on the other side. If we guarantee your security, we're providing capital. You're going to accommodate our preference on how we extract resources here. And so uh, that it's going to be very interesting to see, to take the Argentina example and kind of close with this, is if he goes down that path, that is a democracy, right? So you can't do that on an outright basis, as to how the populace views that within the country and their view of the US. Because I think that that is all going to be on trial over the next 6 to 8 weeks, as knowingly, and we'll discuss, these executive orders are going to come immediately after he's in office.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think the ripple effect is significant here. There's so much complexity, a lot of moving parts for the competition on lithium.
Indeed.
Thanks, Nick. Great to see you. I look forward to covering more news topics, especially next week following Trump's inauguration.
Big week next week.
Big.
Just